November 26, 1943. 21 B-17 flying fortresses from the 381st Bomb Group sliced through German airspace at 27,000 feet, their contrails painting white scars across the frozen sky. The target is Bremen's U-boat construction yards, but nobody on these bombers is thinking about the target right now. They're thinking about the dots appearing at 2 o'clock high, at least 30 Focke-Wulf 90s rolling into attack formation like sharks circling wounded prey. Staff Sergeant Robert Williams, right waist gunner on a B-17 named Devil's Own, watches those dots grow from specks to shapes to aircraft with visible markings. His hands grip the .50 caliber Browning so hard his knuckles turn white even through his thick gloves. When the lead Focke-Wulf reaches what looks like 1,000 yards out, Williams opens up without hesitation. The gun hammers against his shoulder with brutal force, spent brass casings bouncing off the fuselage floor like metallic rain. Tracer rounds arc out into the thin air, chasing the German fighter as it barrels toward them at 400 miles per hour with cannon fire winking orange from its wings. 3 seconds of continuous fire. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. The Focke-Wulf breaks off trailing smoke, maybe a hit, maybe just evading, but Williams keeps his finger locked down on the butterfly trigger. Another German fighter swings into view from a different angle, more hammering, more brass cascading across the floor. The noise inside the bomber is absolutely deafening, even through his leather helmet and oxygen mask. The ball turret gunner below him is firing. The tail gunner's tracers are streaming past the fuselage. Everyone's shooting at everything because when 30 fighters hit a formation all at once, you don't wait for perfect shots or ideal range. You fill the sky with lead and pray desperately that something connects. Then at 10:51 a.m., just 4 minutes into the fight, Williams feels his gun go silent. The bolt locked back. He looks down at the ammunition feed with a sinking feeling in his gut. Empty, 500 rounds gone in 4 minutes of combat. He's got another belt in reserve, but it takes precious seconds to reload while fighters are still swarming around them like angry hornets. His hands shake uncontrollably as he pulls the empty belt clear and threads the new one through the feed mechanism. Around him he hears other guns falling silent in sequence across the bomber. The tail gunner, one of the chin turret guns. They're all running dry at nearly the same time. The bomber formation survives this first wave through luck and formation discipline, but they're still 90 minutes from Bremen and 2 hours from being back over the English Channel where they'll be safe. Williams does the math in his head, the same brutal math that every B-17 gunner knew by heart and dreaded. 500 rounds per gun, 10 guns on a fully armed B-17. Each gun fires 750 to 850 rounds per minute when cycling properly. If you held the trigger down continuously, you'd burn through your entire belt in about 35 to 40 seconds. But nobody fires that long continuously, at least not if they want to survive. You fire in bursts. 3 seconds here, 5 seconds there. Maybe 10 if you're tracking a fighter through a long attack run. Still, even with discipline, even with careful aim and years of training, 4 minutes of intense combat just chewed through his entire primary ammunition supply. This wasn't just Williams's problem that morning over Germany. It wasn't just Devil's Own facing this crisis. Across the entire 381st Bomb Group that day, gunners were experiencing the exact same terrifying situation. By the time the formation finally reached Bremen and dropped their bombs, some aircraft had cycled through both their primary and reserve ammunition completely. 3 B-17s went down on the return leg, falling victim to German fighters that pressed attacks against bombers whose gunners could only watch helplessly, their weapons empty and useless. Back at Ridgewell Airfield that evening, as the sun set over England, the group's gunnery officer, Captain James Hartford, compiled the after-action reports with growing concern. The numbers were absolutely stark. Average ammunition expenditure exceeded 4,200 rounds per aircraft during the mission. Several gunners reported complete depletion of all belts. The 8th Air Force had a serious problem developing, and everyone from the crews to headquarters knew it. The problem wasn't that gunners were trigger-happy cowboys or poorly trained kids who didn't know better. The problem was pure physics meeting geometry at 25,000 feet in sub-zero temperatures. A Browning M2 50 caliber machine gun, the primary defensive weapon on every B-17 flying fortress, cycled at roughly 800 rounds per minute when properly maintained and operating in ideal conditions. That's 13.3 rounds per second hammering out of the barrel. Your standard ammunition belt held 500 rounds of carefully linked ammunition. Do the simple division that every armourer knew by heart. 500 divided by 13.3 equals 37.6 seconds. If you held that trigger down without stopping, without pause, you had 38 seconds of firepower before you were holding an expensive metal tube that couldn't hurt anyone. But here's where the mathematics get significantly worse and the real problem emerges. Luftwaffe doctrine in late 1943 called for coordinated attacks from multiple directions simultaneously, overwhelming bomber defensive fire through sheer numbers and angles. A typical engagement saw German fighters hitting a bomber formation in waves that felt endless, each wave lasting anywhere from 2 to 4 minutes of sustained combat. Intelligence officers at 8th Air Force Headquarters analysed combat footage frame by frame and pilot debriefs word by word. They determined that during peak combat intensity, those moments when 5 or 6 Focke-Wulfs or Messerschmitts were boring in from different angles, gunners fired an average of 60 to 80 rounds every 10 seconds across multiple rapid engagements. Not continuously, which would be worse, but in rapid bursts as targets appeared and disappeared. 3 seconds on one target banking in from 2 o'clock. Pause to track and acquire. 4 seconds on another target diving from 11 o'clock. Brief pause. 5 seconds on a third approaching from beam level. The ammunition evaporated faster than anyone could believe. Let's walk through what this brutal mathematics meant for an actual deep penetration mission into Germany. The typical raid into German industrial heartland lasted between 5 and 7 hours total from takeoff to landing. The bomber stream crossed into German-controlled airspace roughly 2 hours after lifting off from English bases. From that point until they crossed back out after the bomb run, usually another 3 hours, they were under constant threat of attack. Call it 3 hours minimum in hostile territory where death could come screaming out of the sun at any moment. During that window, Luftwaffe fighters typically hit the formation in 3 or 4 major concentrated waves, each separated by 20 to 40 minutes of relative calm. First wave as they crossed the border into occupied Europe. Second wave approaching the target itself. Third wave immediately after bombs away when formations were disrupted. Fourth wave on the way back out toward the Channel. Each wave lasted anywhere from 3 to 8 minutes of active intense combat where everything was chaos and violence. So you're looking at potentially 30 minutes of actual fighting spread across a 3-hour window of tension. Now, 30 minutes doesn't sound that terrible when you've got 500 rounds loaded and ready, right? Except gunners couldn't predict when those waves would hit with any accuracy, how intense they'd be, or how long they'd last. The November 26th Bremen mission saw its first wave deliver 4 solid minutes of sustained combat that drained primary belts. If the second wave matched that intensity, you'd already be deep into your reserve ammunition before even reaching the target. If a third wave hit hard on the return journey, you were praying to every god you knew. 8th Air Force operational analysts ran comprehensive numbers in December 1943, after losses continued mounting. Their report, classified secret at the time but declassified in 1973, laid it out with cold bureaucratic precision. Based on average firing rates documented from September through November missions, the typical B-17 gunner would expend his primary 500-round belt within the first 40 minutes of combat exposure. Reserve belts added another 20 to 30 minutes of capability if used carefully, but missions regularly saw combat windows stretching up to 90 minutes. When you counted all the waves and sporadic attacks, there was a gap, a dangerous and potentially lethal gap, where bombers would be flying through German airspace with empty guns and no defense. Crew survival rates reflected this terrifying reality with brutal clarity. Bombers shot down during the first wave of combat represented only 23% of total losses according to compiled statistics. But bombers lost during third or fourth waves, when ammunition was depleted, accounted for 41% of losses according to November 1943 data analysis. The implication was absolutely clear and deeply disturbing. German pilots were learning to be patient and strategic. Drain the bombers' ammunition early with probing attacks, back off to safe distance, then come in for the kill when the guns fell silent. Some Luftwaffe pilots even reported this tactic explicitly during post-war interviews decades later. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff later recalled in his memoir, "We knew the Americans couldn't shoot forever. Sometimes we'd make feint attacks just to make them waste bullets, then we'd strike when they were helpless." The bomber crews knew it too, with a certainty that kept them awake at night. They could feel it in the weight of those ammunition belts growing lighter, in the cooling barrel of a gun that had just gone silent while enemy fighters still circled like wolves waiting for the wounded to fall behind. The solution didn't come from headquarters staff officers or from some tactical manual revision written by people who'd never been shot at. It came from a maintenance tent at Bassingbourn airfield 60 miles north of London on a cold evening in early November 1943. Sergeant Michael Kopecki was an armourer with the 91st Bomb Group, the kind of guy who could field strip a Browning M2 blindfolded in the dark and diagnose a feeding problem by sound alone. He'd been listening to gunners complain about ammunition shortages for weeks now, watching them come back from missions frustrated, sometimes traumatized, knowing they'd had to watch German fighters make attack runs while their guns sat empty and useless in their hands. Kopecki was sitting in the mess hall after a particularly brutal mission on November 3rd, the Wilhelmshaven raid where the 91st lost 4 aircraft and dozens of men. He was drinking terrible coffee with Technical Sergeant Bill Morrison, a tail gunner who'd burned through both his ammunition belts before the formation even reached the target area. Morrison kept repeating the same thing like a broken record, his hands shaking slightly from exhaustion and fear. "There's got to be a way to make it last. There's got to be a way." That's when Kopecki grabbed a paper napkin from the dispenser and started sketching with a pencil stub. The napkin itself is long gone, lost to history, but Morrison described it years later in a 1987 interview for the Air Force Historical Research Agency archives. Kopecki drew a simple diagram, a B-17 seen from above with lines representing fields of fire from each gun position radiating outward. Then he started thinking out loud in that mechanical way good armourers do. "What if you don't all shoot at once?" he asked. "What if only the guys who actually have the shot fire and everyone else holds?" Morrison pushed back immediately with the objection every combat gunner would raise. "Mike, when 6 fighters are coming at you from 6 different directions, everyone's got a shot at something." "Yeah, but who's got the best shot?" Kopecki tapped his pencil on the napkin diagram, thinking it through. "The fighter coming from 12 o'clock high, that's naturally the top turret's angle and responsibility. The guy coming from 6 o'clock level, that's the tail gunner's bread and butter, his sector. What if we work out who shoots at what based on optimal position, and everyone else holds fire unless their guy doesn't get the kill?" The idea wasn't completely revolutionary or new to warfare. Naval gunnery had used coordinated fire control for centuries on ships. Anti-aircraft batteries used strict sector discipline to avoid wasting ammunition. But nobody had really tried to apply it systematically to bomber defensive gunnery where things happened at incredible speed, where targets appeared and disappeared in seconds, where the chaos of combat made complicated procedures absolutely impossible to execute. Kopecki's critical insight was that it didn't need to be complicated with elaborate rules. It needed to be simple enough that terrified 19-year-olds could execute it while wearing oxygen masks at 27,000 feet, with outside temperature at 40 below zero, and fighters trying to kill them. Over the next week, Kopecki worked intensively with the 91st's gunnery officer, Lieutenant Colonel William Reed, to formalize the concept into something teachable. They divided the space around a B-17 into clear sectors of responsibility that made intuitive sense. Top turret gunner owned high attacks from the forward hemisphere. Ball turret took low approaches from below. Tail gunner had everything behind the wing trailing edge. Waist gunners covered beam attacks from the sides. The critical addition, and this was Kopecki's real innovation that made everything work, was the rotation principle that gave the system its name. If a fighter was in multiple gunner sectors simultaneously, only the gunner with the best angle fired first while others watched and tracked. If the first gunner didn't drive off or hit the fighter within 3 to 5 seconds, the next gunner in the rotation would open up immediately, then the third if needed. Like taking turns but fast enough to maintain continuous fire on the threat from the German pilot's perspective. They called it rotation firing, or sometimes disciplined defensive fire when writing official reports. Reed liked the concept enough to test it under controlled conditions. On November 13th, during a training flight over the peaceful English countryside, he had crews practice the procedure against a towed target sleeve. The results were startling even to the skeptics. Instead of all 10 guns blazing away at once in the traditional method, usually only 2 or 3 were firing at any given moment. Ammunition consumption dropped by more than half immediately. But here's what really mattered and convinced everyone. Rounds actually on target increased dramatically. Gunners who weren't shooting were tracking carefully, watching, ready to take over instantly if the primary gunner missed or didn't stop the threat. The protocol that emerged from those training flights over England became known as the Bassingbourn method, though most crews just called it rotation because it was simpler. By mid-November 1943, Reed had it formalized into a 1-page instruction sheet that went into every crew briefing packet at the base. The rules were straightforward enough to memorize completely, which was absolutely essential because nobody was reading documents during combat when fighters were attacking. Rule 1 established clear sectors of responsibility. The B-17's defensive sphere got divided like slicing a pie into distinct zones. Top turret gunner owned everything from 12 o'clock high to 3 o'clock high and 9 o'clock high, basically the entire upper forward quadrant where most attacks originated. Ball turret took 12 o'clock low through 3 o'clock low and 9 o'clock low, the vulnerable underbelly. Tail gunner had 6 o'clock in all directions, high and low, the classic stern attack position. The 2 waist gunners split beam attacks with right waist taking 3 o'clock level and left waist taking 9 o'clock level. The chin turret, when B-17G started arriving with them in late 1943, owned 12 o'clock level, those terrifying head-on attacks. Rule 2 covered range discipline, which was absolutely critical to making the system work. Gunners were trained to hold fire until attacking fighters reached approximately 1,000 to 1,200 yards distance. At that range, the .50 caliber was still highly effective, but more importantly, you could actually judge whether you had a realistic shot worth taking. Too many gunners had been opening up at 2,000 yards or more, distances where they were just burning ammunition into empty sky with zero chance of hitting anything. The new protocol required visual confirmation that the target was within effective range before firing. Experienced gunners learned to gauge this by the apparent size of the attacking aircraft through their sights. When a Focke-Wulf 90's wingspan looked about the width of your thumb at arm's length through the gun sight, you were at roughly 1,000 yards and could engage. Rule 3 introduced burst discipline, and this was Kowalski's signature contribution to air combat. 3 seconds on target maximum, then release the trigger completely. Count in your head while firing 1001, 1002, 1003. Then pause and assess the situation. Is the fighter breaking off from his attack? Did you hit it and see damage? Is it still coming despite your fire? 3 seconds at 800 rounds per minute equals 40 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. 40 rounds of .50 caliber properly aimed was absolutely enough to damage or destroy a fighter aircraft if they hit. If they didn't stop the attack, you'd given the next gunner in rotation his turn to try. Rule 4 established the rotation sequence that made continuous fire possible. If the primary gunner's 3-second burst didn't stop the attack or drive off the fighter, the secondary gunner, whoever had the next best angle on that particular target, would take over for his 3-second burst without pause, then tertiary if needed. The beauty of this system was that from the German pilot's perspective sitting in his cockpit, he was still facing continuous fire that never stopped. He couldn't tell that 3 different gunners were shooting at him in carefully coordinated sequence. All he knew was tracers kept coming at him throughout his entire attack run, which was psychologically devastating. Communication at 25,000 feet in a B-17 was absolutely brutal under the best circumstances. The intercom worked when it worked, but in the chaos of combat with 4 massive engines roaring and guns hammering, verbal coordination was unreliable at best. So the crews developed a simple system of hand signals that transcended language. A raised fist meant, "I've got this target, I'm engaging." A flat hand wave meant, "He's yours, take him now," pointing directed attention to a fighter others might not have spotted yet. The tail gunner, isolated in his cramped position at the aircraft's extreme rear, had the hardest job in terms of coordination. He couldn't see hand signals from the waist gunners forward of him, so the protocol gave him automatic authority over anything in his sector without question. If he called out a target on the intercom, everyone else knew immediately to hold fire unless he specifically called for help. The system required absolute trust between crew members, the kind you can't mandate or create artificially. A waist gunner had to trust completely that when he held fire, watching a Focke-Wulf 190 scream toward him at 400 miles per hour with cannon blazing, the top turret gunner actually had the shot and would take it and wouldn't let him down. That kind of trust doesn't come from reading a one-page instruction sheet in a briefing room. It comes from training together for months, flying together through flak and fighters, knowing without doubt that the guy in the next position won't let you down when death is seconds away. The German pilots noticed something distinctly strange beginning in December 1943, though they couldn't initially explain it. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, flying with Jagdgeschwader 11 out of Oldenburg, wrote in his detailed combat diary on December 13th, "Today's attack on the fortresses was different from previous engagements. The defensive fire never stopped or slackened. We expected ammunition exhaustion after the first aggressive pass as usual, but the second and third passes were met with equal intensity and accuracy. Either the Americans have doubled their ammunition loads somehow, or they have found a new method of employment." Knoke was a skilled ace with 33 confirmed kills at that point in the war, and he wasn't imagining things or making excuses. What he and other Luftwaffe pilots were experiencing was the illusion created by rotation firing executed properly. When all 10 guns on a B-17 opened up simultaneously in the old method, it created an impressive and intimidating wall of lead that looked devastating. But it was brief and unsustainable. German pilots had learned through experience to recognize the pattern like reading sheet music. First pass would meet heavy fire, so break off and circle. Second pass would meet noticeably lighter fire as belts depleted. Third pass brought scattered shots or complete silence as ammunition ran out. It became a simple tactical calculation that saved German lives. Survive the first attack wave, wait out their ammunition while circling, then close in for the kill when they're helpless. But rotation firing broke that comfortable pattern completely and unpredictably. Because only 2 or 3 guns fired at once in coordinated sequence, the ammunition lasted dramatically longer than Germans expected. More importantly, from a tactical standpoint, the fire appeared continuous throughout their entire attack run. A German fighter making an attack run would face tracer fire for the entire approach from beginning to end, not because every gun was firing simultaneously, but because as one gunner completed his 3-second burst, another was already taking over smoothly. From the cockpit of a Focke-Wulf 90 traveling at 400 miles per hour, you couldn't distinguish between 10 guns firing for 5 seconds and 3 guns firing in rotation for 15 seconds. You just saw tracers coming at you the whole time without pause, and that was terrifying. Major Günther Rahl, who would end the war with 275 kills and become one of Germany's highest-scoring aces, described the phenomenon in a 1978 interview decades later. By early 1944, we noticed the Americans had changed something fundamental in their defensive tactics. Their defensive fire became more persistent and sustained. Before, we could time our attacks around their ammunition expenditure. Now the fire discipline was different, more controlled and measured, but somehow more dangerous and effective. You couldn't wait them out anymore, which changed everything about how we had to fight. The psychological impact on German pilots was significant and measurable through their behavior changes. Fighter tactics relied heavily on aggression and careful timing of attacks. Pilots were trained to press home attacks aggressively, to bore in close despite defensive fire, because they knew that fire would eventually slacken and stop. But when the fire never slackened, when you made your 3rd or 4th pass and still faced steady streams of tracers, it fundamentally changed your mental calculations. Do you keep pressing the attack and risk getting hit, or do you break off and look for an easier target in the formation? That hesitation killed attacking momentum. Luftwaffe after-action reports from January and February 1944 started showing something interesting that analysts noticed. The average number of attack passes per fighter per bomber engagement was declining steadily month by month. In October 1943, German fighters averaged 4.2 attack passes per bomber engagement before either scoring a kill or giving up. By February 1944, that number had dropped significantly to just 2.8 passes. The fighters were breaking off earlier than before, seeking different targets across the formation, spreading their attacks instead of concentrating on individual bombers until they went down in flames. This wasn't a conscious decision by Luftwaffe command structure or headquarters doctrine change. It was individual pilots making individual survival calculations in the moment. When you pressed an attack and the defensive fire stayed steady through your entire approach, your brain started screaming survival warnings. Maybe this particular bomber still had full ammunition somehow. Maybe you should try a different one in the formation that might be more vulnerable. That critical moment of hesitation, that decision to break off and seek another target, was exactly what rotation firing was psychologically designed to create in enemy pilots. Some German pilots eventually figured out what was happening through careful observation. Hauptmann Heinz Baer wrote in March 1944, "The fortresses are not carrying more ammunition than before. They are simply using what they have more cleverly and efficiently. They fire in coordinated shifts, but knowing this intellectually changes nothing practically. When tracers are coming at you, you cannot afford to gamble on whether the next burst will come or not. You must break off." October 14, 1943, Black Thursday as it would be forever known. The second Schweinfurt raid deep into Germany. The 8th Air Force sent 291 B-17s to hit ball bearing factories critical to German war production. 60 bombers didn't come home that day. Another 138 returned with significant battle damage. Of the 2,900 men who flew that mission into hell, 650 were dead, wounded, or captured by day's end. It was the single bloodiest daylight bombing mission of the entire war, and it nearly broke the strategic bombing campaign completely. In the aftermath, as intelligence officers analyzed what went catastrophically wrong, they noticed something buried in the loss data. The 91st Bomb Group flying out of Bassingbourn lost only 1 aircraft out of 18 deployed. The 379th Bomb Group lost 7 out of 20 bombers. The 384th lost 5 out of 16. What made the 91st different from groups with much higher losses? Interviews with surviving crews revealed something interesting. Some 91st gunners had been informally practicing better fire discipline for weeks. Not the full rotation system that Kowalski would later formalize, but a proto-version of coordinated fire. Gunners who resisted the urge to shoot at everything that moved, who coordinated informally with the guy next to them, who made their ammunition last through discipline. The lesson was there in the data and the numbers, but it took the formal Bassingbourn method in November to crystallize it into teachable doctrine. By December 1943, the 91st Bomb Group was flying missions with full rotation protocols in place and working smoothly. Other groups across England were still using traditional free-fire defensive gunnery, where everyone shot at everything. This created a natural experiment, an unintentional but perfect way to measure whether rotation actually worked under real combat conditions or was just theoretical nonsense. December 20th, 1943. Bremen again, that same heavily defended target. The 91st Bomb Group flew as part of a larger 456 bomber strike force. Luftwaffe resistance was absolutely fierce with over 200 German fighters engaging the formation. The 91st lost 2 aircraft out of 21 deployed that day. The 379th Bomb Group, flying the exact same route at the same altitude without rotation training, lost 5 out of 22 bombers. The pattern held across the entire strike force when analysts compiled the numbers. Groups that had begun implementing rotation firing showed consistently lower loss rates, mission after mission. The statistics became more compelling and undeniable with each raid. By early January 1944, 8th Air Force Headquarters had comprehensive data from 12 major raids comparing rotation-trained groups against non-trained groups under similar conditions. The numbers were absolutely stark and impossible to ignore. Rotation-trained groups averaged 8.3% aircraft losses per mission. Non-trained groups, still using old methods, averaged 11.7% losses. That 3.4% difference translated directly to lives saved, roughly 30 additional men surviving per 100 bomber mission. Over the course of a month, across multiple raids, the difference meant hundreds of airmen coming home who otherwise wouldn't have made it. But the benefits went far beyond just raw loss rates in the statistics. After-action debriefs revealed that rotation-trained crews were actually shooting down more German fighters per mission on average. Not because they were firing more rounds, they were actually firing significantly fewer, but because the rounds they did fire were better aimed and more effective. A gunner who fires one carefully aimed 3-second burst at a fighter in optimal range is dramatically more likely to score hits than a gunner who burns through 200 rounds of panicked spray-and-pray fire. The The 91st Bomb Group claimed 23 confirmed fighter kills in December 1943, up substantially from 11 kills in October despite flying fewer total missions. Their ammunition expenditure per mission dropped from an average of 4,800 rounds per aircraft to just 2,900 rounds. On January 11, 1944, Major General James Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force, replacing Ira Eaker. One of Doolittle's first command reviews covered defensive gunnery procedures and effectiveness. The data from rotation-trained groups was presented in detail. Doolittle, a pilot who understood both tactics and engineering from his racing days, saw the logic immediately and completely. On January 28, 1944, 8th Air Force issued Technical Order 1 B-17 Gibran, making rotation firing mandatory for all heavy bomber groups operating in theater. The order included Kowalski's basic protocol, now refined with input from multiple groups, and mandated that all crews complete rotation training before being certified for combat missions over Europe. Making something mandatory and making it actually work in practice are two completely different problems, as any military officer knows. Through February and March 1944, gunnery instructors at 8th Air Force bases scattered across England worked intensively to bring every single crew up to speed on rotation firing techniques. But something interesting and unexpected happened during that training period. The crews themselves started improving the system organically, adding refinements that the original protocol hadn't considered because they came from real combat experience. The first major innovation came from the 303rd and 3rd Bomb Group stationed at Molesworth. Their gunnery officer, Captain Raymond Foster, noticed that during certain attack angles, specifically beam attacks where German fighters came in level from 3 or 9 o'clock, having only one waist gunner fire was actually tactically inefficient. The attacking fighter was in both waist gunner's optimal firing zone simultaneously for several seconds. Having one gunner fire while the other just watched felt wasteful of capability. Foster proposed what he called suppression pairs. Instead of strict rotation, both waist gunners would fire together in coordinated 3-second bursts specifically at beam attackers. The combined fire was absolutely devastating in practice. Two 50 caliber guns converging on the same target from slightly different angles created a cone of fire that was nearly impossible to fly through without taking hits. The concept got tested under real combat conditions on March 6, 1944 during the Berlin raid, the first time American bombers hit the German capital in daylight. The 303rd reported that their paired waist gunner technique drove off 18 separate beam attacks without a single aircraft in their formation taking significant damage from those angles. Other groups started adopting suppression pairs immediately after hearing about the results. By April 1944, it was fully integrated into the standard rotation protocol. Single fire for most attack angles, paired fire for beam approaches. The second major refinement came from an unexpected source. The P-51 Mustang escort fighters that started arriving in significant numbers in early 1944, with the range to go all the way. The Mustang had the range to escort bombers all the way to targets deep in Germany and back, finally solving the escort problem. But coordination between bomber gunners and escort fighters was initially absolutely chaotic and dangerous. Gunners were shooting at friendly P-51s, mistaking them for German fighters. Escorts were getting in the way of defensive fire. It was a dangerous mess that killed friendly pilots. Lieutenant Colonel John Meyer, commanding the 352nd Fighter Group, worked out a practical solution with bomber commanders in March 1944 after several near disasters. The escorts would clear the airspace at long range, hitting German fighters before they reached the bomber formation to establish air superiority. When enemy fighters did break through to close range inside 800 yards, that became exclusively the gunner's zone. Escorts would pull off and let the bomber defensive fire do its work without interference. This created an effective layered defense that protected everyone. P-51s owned 3,000 yards to 800 yards. Bomber gunners owned 800 yards to point-blank range. The coordination required strict discipline from both sides, but it worked beautifully in practice. By late April, the system was fluid and natural. Bomber crews could focus their fire exclusively on immediate threats without worrying about hitting their own escorts. Meanwhile, the escorts could press attacks aggressively without flying into bomber defensive fire and getting shot down by friendly fire. The psychological effect on Luftwaffe pilots was absolutely crushing and demoralizing. They had to fight through swarms of P-51s just to reach the bombers in the first place, and if they somehow survived that gauntlet, They then faced coordinated defensive fire from the bombers that never seemed to run out of ammunition. The numbers from spring 1944 tell the story with mathematical precision. April through June missions showed ammunition consumption had dropped to an average of 2,600 rounds per aircraft per mission, a 46% reduction from the pre-rotation average of 4,800 rounds. Meanwhile, confirmed fighter kills claimed by bomber gunners increased dramatically, from an average of 0.8 per mission per group in late 1943 to 1.9 per mission per group by May 1944. The guns were firing less but hitting significantly more, and most importantly, the bombers were coming home intact. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, rotation firing wasn't a new experimental technique anymore. It was just how things were done, standard operating procedure. Replacement gunners arriving in England from the States trained on rotation from day one of their combat preparation. It was as fundamental as learning to clear a jam or adjust for windage, just part of being a gunner. Walk onto a modern AC-130 gunship today and you'll find something interesting in the fire control protocols that govern how it fights. The aircraft carries 3 different weapon systems mounted in its side: a 25mm Gatling gun, a 40mm Bofors cannon, and a massive 105mm howitzer. They don't all fire simultaneously even when multiple targets are present and threatening. Instead, the fire control officer assigns weapons to specific targets based on priority, angle, and ammunition conservation. Sound familiar? That's rotation firing evolved through decades and computerized, but the core principle is identical to what Sergeant Kopecki sketched on a napkin in 1943. The US Navy's Phalanx CIWS, the close-in weapon system that protects ships from incoming anti-ship missiles, uses a remarkably similar concept in its programming. The system can track multiple threats simultaneously with its sophisticated radar, but it engages them sequentially rather than spraying fire at everything detected. Target 1 gets a precisely calculated burst, then assess. If threat continues, fire again. If threat eliminated, move immediately to target 2. The computer makes these decisions in milliseconds that would take humans minutes, but the fundamental logic is pure rotation discipline. Controlled bursts, assessment between shots, conservation of ammunition while maintaining continuous engagement capability against threats. Even modern infantry squad tactics show Kowalski's fingerprints if you know where to look. The concept of talking guns, where squad members coordinate fire so that some shoot while others reload, maintaining continuous fire without everyone shooting simultaneously, is standard doctrine in every NATO military today. It's taught at Fort Benning, at Quantico, at training bases around the world to every infantry soldier. Most instructors teaching it have absolutely no idea it traces back directly to bomber gunners over Germany 80 years ago. The reason rotation firing has endured across platforms and decades is because it solved a problem that transcends any specific weapon or platform: the finite resource problem. You never have unlimited ammunition regardless of how much you carry. You never have unlimited time in a fight. You need to make what you have last long enough to survive the entire engagement. The innovation wasn't technological in nature. The B-17s guns in 1944 were the exact same guns they'd been using in 1942. The innovation was purely conceptual and psychological. It was realizing that discipline creates capability, that coordination multiplies effectiveness, that sometimes shooting less means hitting more. Military historians often overlook rotation firing in their books because it's not dramatic or exciting. It didn't involve new aircraft or secret weapons or brilliant generals. It was just better training, better coordination, better thinking applied to an existing problem. But its impact on the air war over Europe was absolutely profound and measurable. 8th Air Force loss rates declined dramatically from 11.4% per mission in October 1943 to just 4.2% per mission by June 1944. Many factors contributed to this improvement, obviously. P-51 Mustang escorts with range improved overall tactics, declining Luftwaffe pilot quality and fuel supplies. But rotation firing was a significant part of that equation. Those percentage points represented thousands of airmen who made it home to their families instead of dying over Germany. Each percentage point was hundreds of lives saved, hundreds of families that didn't receive telegrams, hundreds of men who got to grow old. Heinz Knoke survived the war, unlike so many of his comrades who fell over Europe. In his memoir, published in 1953, He devoted an entire chapter to what he called the ammunition mystery that had puzzled him throughout 1944. He knew intellectually that the Americans hadn't increased their ammunition loads. His intelligence officers had confirmed through shot-down bombers that the B-17's armament hadn't changed at all. He knew they weren't using some wonder weapon or secret technology. But he never quite figured out the rotation system completely, even after the war ended and records became available. They simply made what they had last longer, he wrote with a mixture of admiration and frustration, and that made all the difference in the world. That napkin Kowalski drew on is gone forever, probably thrown away that same night. The maintenance tent at Bassingbourn is gone, demolished decades ago. Most of the men who flew those desperate missions are gone now too, passed away in the years since. But every single time a modern weapon system uses coordinated fire discipline, every time a gunner learns to fire in controlled bursts rather than continuous streams, every time ammunition conservation becomes part of tactical doctrine anywhere in the world, Kowalski's simple idea lives on. The best innovations don't announce themselves with fanfare, they just quietly become the way things are done, so fundamental that people forget they were ever innovations at all.